This story begins 4.6 billion years ago when a star was born on the periphery of the Milky Way galaxy in the Orion Arm. Dense hot gases and dust formed a protoplanetary disk around it. This seemingly average star was our Sun, and the cloud-like disk around it would transform into our solar system. The protoplanetary cloud contained huge amounts of mineral grains that began to stick together in the process known as accretion. They formed larger and larger chunks of rocky matter. As these chunks grew larger, they started attracting more and more small matter, becoming asteroids, building blocks of the future planets. Larger asteroids attracted smaller ones, forming rocky clusters that gradually collapsed into themselves. With time, this so-called gentle clumping led to the formation of the planetesimals and then the protoplanets, which over time were to become actual planets. And one of these was our Earth. But things were far from being settled. 4.5 billion years ago, right upon its formation, a tremendous catastrophic event known as the Giant Impact is believed to have happened to our planet. Another planetary object, about the size of Mars, named Theia, appeared on a collision course with the young Earth. A space catastrophe became inevitable. The collision of two heavenly bodies generated so much heat that Earth's surface liquefied and became an endless ocean of molten magma. Although Earth survived this massive impact, Theia did not. Its debris mixed with the material blown out of our planet and began orbiting Earth, forming an accretion disk around it. Larger chunks of matter attracted smaller ones and shaped into a newborn satellite over time, our Moon. Upon its formation, Moon was almost 16 times closer to Earth than it is today and remained geologically active for the next 1.5 billion years. Over time, Earth cooled down and its surface hardened. Our planet's primordial atmosphere consisted of ammonia, methane, neon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and water that had been outgassed from the depth of the planet's mantle. Young Earth was a hostile place. A dense, high-pressure atmosphere of deadly gases engulfed the hot, dry and barren realm of volcanic terrains. This turbulent period of our planet's earliest history is called the Hadean Eon, named after the ancient Greek god of the underworld, Hades. This eon was marked with intense geological activity when countless volcanoes were erupting all over the globe. About 100 million years after the collision with Theia, Earth cooled down enough for the water in the atmosphere to transform into vapor, and because of this, the very first watery clouds appeared in the sky. Their white colour increased Earth's albedo so that more solar energy was reflected into space. This allowed the planet to cool down even further. Finally, water was able to achieve its liquid form. Although the temperatures on Earth were still well above 100 degrees Celsius, very high atmospheric pressure did not let it boil out and evaporate. The water in the clouds condensed into droplets, which headed down to the ground, and the very first rain started on our planet. Possibly, this rain went on for thousands of years, gradually covering our globe with water. Eventually, the bodies of water started to form, the first lakes, and the first seas. Until the entire surface was covered with water, turning Earth into an ocean world with no dry land, wrapped in a reddish methane mist. This is what our planet looked like 4 billion years ago at the end of the Hadean Eon, the first chapter of its history. As we mentioned earlier, young Earth was an extremely geologically active planet. Soon, volcanic cones started to rise above the seemingly endless water surface. They became small volcanic islands that started forming archipelagos, the first bits of dry land to be found in that vast primordial ocean. Lava erupted from the volcanoes and started accumulating around the islands and archipelagos, growing into larger land masses, the first proto-continents that have now long vanished. The Hadean Aeon, when our planet had just formed and settled, was now over, and 4 billion years ago another geological epoch began. It is called the Archean Aeon, which in Greek means ancient. From this early, hellish volcanic realm, Earth turned into a world that started to resemble our present one. There were lands and water, clouds and rain, but the rocky land remained barren. The atmosphere was still unbreathable for any known animal or plant, and the oceans were anoxic. Although the young sun was 25% dimmer than today, it was intensively bombarding our planet's surface with deadly ultraviolet radiation. Today, the protective ozone layer keeps us safe from it, but 4 billion years ago it simply could not form, as there was no oxygen at all in the ancient atmosphere. Despite having conditions we would consider inhospitable for us today, Archean Earth was already much more than just another dead rocky planet in space. Quite the opposite. It was teeming with microscopic life forms invisible to the naked eye. The waters and soil of Earth were populated with primitive microscopic organisms. These single-celled ancient microbes are called prokaryotes and are still alive and well today. That one cell that makes a prokaryote does not contain any organelles and lacks a nucleus. Despite being so primitive, prokaryotes qualify under all the criteria that define life. They were completely self-contained and autonomous, which meant their existence was not dependent on any other organisms. They consumed chemicals and transformed them into energy necessary for their bodies, carrying out the process known as metabolism. Prokaryotes were able to develop, evolve, and most importantly, reproduce. Organic elements became living organisms only when they organized into complex structures and obtained the mechanism that allowed them to replicate and pass on the genetic material. Scientists think that at first, a single-stranded RNA molecule functioned as such a mechanism. It was a self-sustained chemical system that was able to produce its own copies. RNA was able to store the information about how to build a copy of an organism, as well as replicate itself according to this information. But there was one problem with RNA molecules. They were relatively unstable, and the catalysts, or enzymes, often damaged them during the metabolic process. The solution was the emergence of a much more stable double-stranded molecule that we know as DNA. It was essentially a double RNA with a different sugar. Since then, these two molecules have been working in tandem. While DNA reliably stored an organism's genetic information, RNA became a workhorse. It took part in the processes of transcription and translation of an organism's genome into the actual production of proteins, as well as in the replication process. These first microorganisms seemed to thrive in the harsh conditions of ancient Earth, feeding on the chemical nutrients. They also might have been resistant to the deadly solar UV radiation with no oxygen, and thus no ozone layer in the atmosphere to block it. Our planet kept evolving further. 3.6 billion years ago, Earth was mostly covered by an ocean containing volcanic islands and archipelagos. However, according to research, a supercontinent named Valbara was formed. Today, geologists find its ancient traces in Western Australia and South Africa. Meanwhile, the microorganisms that populated our young planet not only kept evolving themselves, but also started to change the world they inhabited. Quite early in their history, prokaryotes split into two major domains, bacteria and archaea. Superficially, the two groups looked similar in shape, but they differed from each other in their genetic and molecular characteristics. Later in our story, archaea would play a crucial role in the emergence of the third major domain of organisms called eukarya, microbes and multicellular forms that contain nuclei in their cells. Humans, animals and plants also belong to this domain. But during the Archean Aeon, it was bacteria that were transforming our planet's environment and making it suitable for the emergence of complex life forms. For now, our story focuses on Cyanobacteria, a phylum of bacteria that were previously and erroneously called blue-green algae. All other microorganisms that inhabited our planet during the Archean times were employing chemosynthesis. This, the process when an organism consumes chemical nutrients from its environment to obtain energy. But Cyanobacteria did something revolutionary. They started getting energy for their bodies direct from the sunlight in a process called photosynthesis. Between 3.8 and 3.5 billion years ago, but possibly even earlier, Cyanobacteria started forming microbial mats and building layered dome-like stony structures called stromatolites, which were visible to the naked eye. Cyanobacteria populated the slimy mat layer on the top surface of the domes, which were usually scattered in near-shore tidal areas. When the tides were low, the microbes were actively photosynthesizing, staying above the water surface. During the high tides, fine sediments floating in the water were carried over the stromatolites, getting trapped in the sticky microbial mats. When the layer of sediments became thick enough to block the sunlight, Cyanobacteria moved upwards to move once again, exposed to the sun. The process repeated on and on. The fine layers kept accumulating on top of each other, and stromatolites grew larger and taller. They could grow up to several meters high, forming the first underwater reefs, long before the emergence of corals. Cyanobacteria also formed many new minerals which were essential in the continent building process. If we were to look at our planet from space 3.1 billion years ago, we would still see only a single significant landmass, the supercontinent known as Ur, whose name translates as original or primitive in German. While being larger than its predecessor Valbara, Ur was still a relatively small continent. It consisted of parts of Australia, Antarctica, India and Madagascar. Before we move on with our story, we must return to Cyanobacteria. As we know, the process of photosynthesis, which Cyanobacteria actively conducts, leads to releasing a very particular byproduct into the environment, and this byproduct is oxygen. Theoretically, our planet's atmosphere should have been enriched with oxygen since the emergence of photosynthesizing cyanobacteria in the first part of the Archean Aeon, at least 3.5 billion years ago. But the scientific data shows a different picture. Our planet's atmosphere remained anoxic till about 2.5 billion years ago. So where did all the oxygen that had been released by cyanobacteria for an entire billion years go then? Seemingly, unlike today, Archean oceans were green in colour, rich with greenish ferrous iron dissolved in them. When cyanobacteria were photosynthesizing, instead of freely releasing into the environment, they released oxygen that bonded ferrous iron and oxidized it. As a result, instead of receiving pure oxygen, the oceans were filled with rusty iron as the byproduct of cyanobacterial activity. While ferrous iron is dissolvable in water, oxidized iron is not. Once it was released into the ocean, it sank to the sea floor. When photosynthesizing during the day, Cyanobacteria were producing iron particles that culminated at the bottom. But at night, no iron was released, which explains its accumulation into layers or bands. These massive Archean formations were layers of iron oxides, alternate with cherts and shales, and are now discovered all over the world. These deposits of layered iron are called BIFs, banded iron formations. Today, BIFs are exploited for the commercial mining of iron ore, which is used in steel production. It is fascinating to realize that all steel products, from kitchen appliances to the cars we drive, are available to us due to the activity of ancient bacteria that lived billions of years ago. It has been 2.5 billion years since the Archean Aeon came to an end, and we are moving on to the next chapter of our planet's history. We will witness catastrophic climate changes and the evolution of primitive microorganisms into the very first multicellular plants and animals.